All right, we're back. What's up, guys? It's been a minute since I've made one of these sort of off-the-cuff videos. I've got meetings here in like 15 minutes, so I'm going to try to keep this as condensed as possible. One of the topics that's come up in the community quite a bit, especially with these new reports that have come out, you might have read them. MIT has launched a study. They interviewed like 300 different sort of medium to large companies talking about AI, and oftentimes the result is the same, which is everybody's excited about it, everybody's creating demos, but 95% of projects don't ever go into production. So I thought it would be valuable as a company that we have put plenty of agents into production and have had agents that have failed. I want to talk about probably one of the biggest differentiator between the two and where I wish I had spent way more time, and that's just testing our agents. Now for us, oftentimes the vast majority of the builds that we do are voice agents. So I'm going to really sort of hone in on that, but a lot of what I'm talking about could apply to any type of agent that you are building. Now, for some ground rules, when I talk about an agent, I'm simply referring to anything you can communicate with, regardless of the medium, whether it's chat, voice, VR, whatever, that can do something. That's a really important thing. The difference between ChatGPT and an agent, in my perspective, is ChatGPT can't really do anything within my business. It doesn't have access to my data, doesn't have access to my customers' information, doesn't have access to, or doesn't have the ability to change anything on my backend systems. So it's a very self-contained thing, which is cool for information, but it's not very agentic. It doesn't really do anything for me, except for giving me information. So that's what I want to talk about today. How do you go from a demo that looks cool to something that you can actually put into production with real people? There's three different sort of layers here that we test for. And I think from the most important to the least important is how I'm going to go. The most important for me has always been the backend automations. And here's where that sort of belief stems from. It stems from, after putting enough of these agents into production, I have learned that people will forgive latency, they will forgive how robotic something sounds, they will forgive how slow something is to a certain degree, as long, and this is super important, as it is useful. That is the key differentiator. The reason why people dislike IVR systems. What an IVR system is, if you ever called a bank and you've told them, hey, I want to open a new account, I want to close an account, whatever the case is, oftentimes you'll find yourself with these systems where they keep sort of sending you to different departments, right? Press 1 for this, press 2 for that. The reason those are frustrating, at least in my belief, is that these are only there to waste your time or to stall you so that the agents can finish up with whatever they're doing so they can deal with you. It's not a very productive spend of time. I'm sure it's also about efficiency and what team you're going to talk to, etc. But it's a gigantic waste of time. People are actually much more interested in getting the problem solved than they are with who is solving it. If I've got a leak on my roof and I call a roofing company or a construction company, I don't care whether it's a robot, a man, a woman, a dog who picks up the phone. I don't care. Just get somebody to come check this out. That's the only thing that's on my mind. Same thing, if I'm calling my bank, if I'm calling my dentist, I'm not saying I as in this are my own personal beliefs. Individuals that we talk to, people on the other side of the phone, your customers, don't care nearly as much as you think about how good the voice sounds. Only care about one thing, and that's getting their problem resolved. If it's calling a bank, that's can I open an account? If it's calling a dentist, it's can I book an appointment? If it's any sort of service-based business, if it's an e-com brand, do you guys deliver here? Can I place an order? Can I get a refund? Can I get a replacement? That is what your customer cares about much more than whether it's Sally or John or a robot answering the phone. With all of that out of the way, the number one thing you want to test. So we've established the most important thing is usefulness. Test out every single automation that your voice agent or that your agent is connected to. This is the number one thing to test for. You don't even need to talk to your agent for this to see if this actually works, because there's sort of two layers here, right? On one side, and this is how you want, this even goes back to how do you even approach building an agent, at least voice agents for us. And the way we would typically do that, and forgive my amazing design skills, but when you're building something, you have to realize that, especially when you're coming inbound, people have different intents. And an intent, that I've made videos about this before, but typically your intents will have a distribution chart that looks something like this. This is line number 1, and then let's say I've got another line here that looks like this, right? Your intent to volume, the correlation between intent and volume will look something like this. It'll look something like this, which is, let's assume that this is volume, right? And then this is intent. The volume, vast majority of the volume is going to be for a very few intent, and then it'll look something like this. Now, this is a really important graph to conceptualize. The reason for that is that this will never necessarily reach zero. It'll only keep getting smaller and smaller, because let's say you have 10,000 calls. I'm sure one of those people will ask about something ridiculous or have a really weird intent. Now the question becomes, well, do I want to build a robot that can handle that intent? And it's a very sharp point right here. This point, let me make this even smaller so you can differentiate it. This point right here, this is the point that it is typically not worth building automations for. And the reason why this even matters is I've got my intent, right? Now let me move this over here. And I've got intent 1, intent 2, and intent 3. Right, let's assume that 80% of the calls are about these specific intents. Now, the thing is for each intent, I'm going to have to build an automation that's associated with it. So let's assume this is for a restaurant. I'm doing this off the cuff if you can't tell. Let's assume this is for a restaurant. And let's assume that this was somebody. Keep in mind, when somebody's calling a restaurant, they're not always calling for the same thing. I'll give you an example. It's very possible that this individual is calling to book a table, right? This individual might be calling to about menu options. This individual might be calling, or a different intent is they want to cancel a table. Now, I'm also going to put in here one more intent, which is going to be change a table. And I think as thoughts run through my mind, I might add more intents. Let's leave it like this for now. So the reason why I'm showing you all this is you have to understand that when you're booking a table, a few different things have to happen for that table for you to even be able to book that table. Number one is, does your system, your CRM, is there anything in the background that allows it, or is there any way to book a table with your system? Question number one. This is where we start getting into API documentation, and if you're doing this for somebody else, part of the discovery process is actually finding out, part of the discovery process is, do I have the right tools, or is the system that I am using or that my client is using compatible with building an AI agent on top of? Because if I have a system, I think the most popular one for restaurants, and I've used this example before, is like Toast. Well, I first need to figure out, does Toast even have an API that I can connect to send requests to? And more importantly, because this is pretty binary, right? This is either a yes or a no. But if it is a yes, then the question becomes, okay, well then, what do I need in order for this to happen? Right? Like if it's no, well, there's not really much I can do. If they don't have an API, then the only real option is to have another system handle it. So now the answer is, if the answer is yes, then there's probably gonna be some parameters. Because when you're booking a table, you wanna ask a couple different things. For example, the most common one is when. And then you wanna ask how many. These are at least the two basic questions that I'm pretty sure every restaurant is going to ask you. When are you coming and how many people are coming? Pretty straightforward. Let me move some of this stuff around. So once you have all this, the reason why I even bring this up is when you're testing, you actually want to test for this. So in your booking a table thing, you want to test, do you have an automation that is set up that can send a request to Toast, right? Like let's say it's a post request. And within that post request, when and how many? Are you able to do that? And then if you are, well, what does the response look like? And keep in mind, the response will obviously depend on whether or not those tables are available. But then the question becomes, have you built your infrastructure? Have you built your agent to be able to handle all different types of responses? So if it's a yes, then cool. But what happens if it's a no? Do you have a recheck thing? And this blends together with your entire agent as a whole, which is, if it's a no, then you probably want to inform customer that you couldn't find an answer, or you couldn't find a reservation, or you couldn't find an available table. But that's not really the perfect experience, because one of two things are going to happen. You're either expecting the user to say, okay, well, do you have any other dates, or it's just going to hang up. So if you know that those are the only two options that are really going to happen, you might as well do the second one, because that's the only one that's actually positive. So then you want to make sure you don't find a table, that you run another request, right? And this will be in parallel, which is you would create another post request to see nearest date for that amount of people, right? And this can be nearest date, nearest hour, and you want to do this for every single intent that you have. This is why it's so important to have this visual in your mind. What is the intent to distribution chart. Normally, it'll look like this. Your goal as you're building one of these agents is to figure out, well, what is within this? Like, what are the intents that fall in this zone right here? Because this is where the vast majority of the volume is. It's not worth building and testing all of this, because there's so little calls that are going to go through this that it's not even worth it. And one more chart I'll show you is, I'll just use, let's do, oh, that's actually pretty straight. Okay. One thing to consider is the more automations, the more complex your agent is. I don't think about complexity. Let's pretend that complexity was here, right? And then testing is here. The more complex something is, the more you actually have to test it. Like, this is what those curves look like. It is insane. Because the more stuff you add, the more stuff can go wrong. So let's say I've added one more node here, right? Or one more automation. It might be a small one. But now that might have broken something else. I've got to test for everything again to make sure that the whole system works in production. This is why the vast majority of projects never go into the production. People vastly underestimate just how much work goes into getting one of these agents off the ground. Now, once you've tested the backend stuff, the other stuff is actually pretty simple. For humaneness, which is how good it sounds, typically I'll just get a VA to do a few hundred calls and just test out different scenarios. Have like a spreadsheet, and it says I have to collect first name, last name, and email address. What happens if I give it a first name? What happens if I only give it a last name? What happens if I mumble? Stuff like that, right? And typically I'll have a spreadsheet where the VA just needs to check whichever box they want, or whichever box went correctly, or went through correctly. And then as far as scripting is concerned, I mean, with the models that we have now, it's kind of hard to screw up the script, but there's plenty of tools. I'll share with you just a couple. The one that I see the most right now, Sakura, yeah, this one is actually pretty good. It's a bit more on the expensive side. I think it's like $1,000 a month. Otherwise, we've also used Hemming. I think it's Hemming. These are AI testing platforms. They're good in their own rights. However, the point of this video is I'm less concerned with Hemming or Sakura. My concern is, do my automations work correctly? Once those work, once the tools are being called correctly, then what happens during the call is actually pretty simple, especially with how intelligent these models have become. There's not much that's going to go wrong with the actual script itself, but the vast majority of time, most of the work will go on the backend automations instead of what the agent actually says. Now, where these tools are super useful is to make sure that the tools are being called at the right time. So if I'm checking for a table, I want to make sure that I'm not calling a tool to check my backend until I have both the when and where, if we're still using the restaurant example. On that note, thanks for watching. Hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to just leave a comment and I will try to get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks, everybody.